Hello, I'm Dr. Lisa College. Welcome to Culture by Neurodesign. Now, the work that I do with organisations and with teams is about building neuroinclusion into their working culture. And what I want to do in today's episode is to share an example of where my son, my autistic son, Chris, and I were beneficiaries of an approach like this. But first, I'll give you a bit of background for some context as to what I'm going to share. Now, this is so important because the future of neurodivergence inclusion can't be only about applying the accommodations model, by which I mean that someone shares a diagnosis to their manager who then adapts their team behaviour and their tools around that person. Neurodivergence is already too prevalent, and it's becoming more so, for this approach to be sustainable. If that's all we rely on, we just end up with a patchwork of exceptions that, with the best will in the world, is fragile and difficult to sustain. It's also a really unattractive endpoint for organisations whom I'm afraid often respond by doing the bare minimum, and that is absolutely not what we want. Now, as Jakub Raski, employment law, HR and health and safety specialist at Corona UK told me recently, Lisa, you don't actually need a diagnosis to trigger the duty to accommodate. Design for inclusion, don't wait for paperwork. And the accommodations model is wonderful when it is truly applied to exceptions. People who are blind, people who need to use a wheelchair, for example. But it's not designed for the level of neurodivergence that is rapidly emerging in our workforces, and that's only going to get higher, with 53% of Gen Z identifying as autistic or dyslexic or dyscalculic or ADHD or otherwise neurodivergent. I'll put a link in the episode notes to an article that I wrote about why autism at work programs need to evolve if you'd like to read more about this. The work I do is about building cultures where accommodations can do what they were designed for, which is to support the exceptions, not to carry the everyday, the neurodivergent increasingly every day. Our first approach is to embed inclusion into the system, rather than our first approach being to adjust case by case. Okay, so that's the context. And what I want to do in this episode is to share how I saw this idea brought to life recently at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. Now, a couple of weekends ago, I flew with Chris, my autistic son, who also has learning difficulties, to visit his grandparents, my parents. So he last flew 7 years ago when he was a baby, and there's a good reason that we've avoided it since. All of the unknown and the busyness, these are difficult things for everyone to deal with when they're travelling, for everyone who's flying, but they're especially difficult for an autistic person. But he's been doing so well recently, and we've all been learning more and more about how we can help him to anticipate new things and get better at them, that we wanted to practice, with a view to eventually making it possible to travel by plane as a family again. So we thought about what would give us the highest chance of a successful first experience within Chris's memory. And that was Chris flying with mummy on my own, so that we remove the additional excitement of immediately flying as a family of 4. He tends to be calmest with me. I'd made the trip on my own a couple of months earlier, so I was familiar with the changes in the airport since I used to travel regularly. And we were going to a known location to my parents in the UK. I also bought him a Pikachu cuddly toy as a surprise, and that was important. It became his anchor throughout the whole experience. We didn't have any check-in luggage to reduce the waiting time as much as you can do at airports. I also registered for assisted travel. It was my first time doing that. So my husband and I had read all about what to expect online, but still I had lots of questions about what it would really be like. At both ends, on both the outward and return journeys, there were staff to meet us, and they asked what we needed. They didn't tell us what we needed, they asked us. I asked for help to jump the queues, basically, but nothing more, although more was offered, such as someone to accompany us the whole time through the airport, or carts to transport us within the airport and things like that. The staff that helped us and who accompanied us through security and passport controls were calm, and they were kind. And they walked us through check-in and they walked us through passport control so we didn't have to queue. And beyond that, every member of staff that I encountered, including people in airport shops and restaurants who were nothing to do with KLM, who we were flying with, knew what the sunflower lanyard meant. Chris was wearing the sunflower lanyard, which indicates invisible disabilities. None of these people knew the details of our situation, but regardless, they all helped. Now, because we were flying on small city hopper planes, we had to take buses to and from the aircraft at the Schiphol end. We couldn't walk directly from the departures area into the aeroplane. We had to take a bus. And the staff at the gates also arranged a separate bus, so we didn't have to be in a crowded bus, which was lovely. And because we waited in our seats on the plane until everyone had disembarked before we got off, Chris and Pikachu, of course, even got to visit the cockpit at both ends with really very welcoming pilots who let him sit in the pilot's seat and push buttons and make noise and all kinds of things. Was it perfect? No, it was not perfect. There were still long waits in between the escorts, and it was still stressful for both of us. But all that help, it made the experience doable. And even though the experience around the flying was still difficult, it made the flying itself fun. So when we were actually on the plane and in our seats, everything was wonderful. When we took off, Chris shouted out, "We're flying!" both times. So that part and the cockpit experiences were pure joy. What struck me most was that the support wasn't about control at all. There was a huge amount of trust. Schiphol and KLM knew in advance that we needed assistance for cognitive impairment. That was all the information that I gave. They never asked for proof. We didn't have to provide a diagnosis. There was no need for long explanations. Of course, there's still queues. It's still busy in the airport. Of course, there's still a system which exists for very good reason, and we respect that. But within the constraints of that system and what they had to do to keep everybody secure and safe, the airports and KLM worked with flexibility and respect for our situation. They didn't make my son fit their system any more than they had to. They adapted the system within its framework to fit his needs as much as they reasonably could. And that's exactly the approach that I call freedom within a framework. Structure where it's needed, but within that structure, flexibility that enables. In a business, your structure would be your vision, your mission, your deliverables, your quality agreements, those kind of things. But the freedom would be how those things are delivered, which almost never matters. You give people the freedom to decide how they deliver those things for you. So as I said, the experience wasn't perfect. There were still opportunities for improvement, but it was much better than nothing. And I think that's also such an important lesson for us. Being 40% or 60% of the way to where you want to go is better than being 0%. It's better to start and offer something with your working culture than wait until you think you have the perfect plan and only then get started. Just get going, just make a start. So this is a great example of how we can move from an accommodations model to a cultural one. The old approach, which is often what I talk about as the old leadership playbook, was all centered around more control, more process, more motivation, and that works in stable times. But today's world is not stable, it's volatile and it's neurodiverse. I think it's not reasonable to ask leaders to personally juggle every unique need that they're already encountering in their teams and that they will increasingly encounter in the future. And indeed, as Jakub Radzki, the employment law and HR specialist at Krona UK, told me, Lisa, inconsistency opens the door to discrimination issues. The most effective organisations embed inclusive practices in their culture, not as exceptions. But it is reasonable, I think, to expect leaders to anticipate the increasing levels of reported neurodiversity around us. It's always been there at this very high level, but people are feeling more confident about sharing their differences these days, and they are expecting organizations to provide working environments that better match their styles. That's why I developed the FIT cultural model to describe what a neuro-inclusive working culture looks like. F is for fair. Everybody has an equal, equivalent opportunity to succeed. I is for intentional. That inclusion is designed in, not bolted on after somebody tells you that they're neurodivergent. And T is for team-minded, where we have a shared responsibility for team norms, which replaces individual heroics and performance. When we design like this, neuro-inclusion becomes more consistent, more credible, and importantly, sustainable and more attractive for managers and for organizations. Accommodations can do what they do so well in that situation, which is to enable in occasional situations. What we have made the default then is trust. And before we wrap up, remember the key insight that I'm illustrating with this story today. Neuro-inclusion thrives on trust over control. This is a foundation of sustainable neuro-inclusive culture, and it's what transforms our systems from being reactive to being enabling. So what can you do about this now that you've listened almost to the end of this podcast? Well, I will tell you. I want to leave you with a question that's inspired by a slide that I often share with leadership teams, and it's based on published research about how team members describe teams, the actual words they use to describe teams that are neuro-inclusive as opposed to those that are not neuro-inclusive. Now have a think about how you would like people in your team to actually describe your team to others. Do you want them to say that your team is toxic, obviously not neuro-inclusive, or curious, which is a characteristic of a neuro-inclusive team? Do you want them to say it's chaotic or organized, with organized being neuro-inclusive? Blame-driven or respectful? Is it profit at all costs, regardless of what this does to your people? Or is it integrity-driven, where there's a balance between keeping an eye on the results and on the mental health of your team members? The culture that you, as a leader, design, that remember is fit, fair, intentional, and team-minded, that culture determines the answer as to how people will describe your team. Now, if you'd like to explore how to systematize fit, how to systematize neuro-inclusion in your team, or uncover where hidden energy drains are limiting your team's performance, drop me an email or reserve time for a free performance leaks audit on my website. Because a team that runs on trust instead of control feels a lot better for everyone, and it performs better too. Thanks for listening.